Okay, it looks like our list of folks who are joining is slowing down, so we're going to go ahead and get started. For everyone's reference, this session is being recorded and it will be posted on the HUD Exchange sometime in the next week or two, as soon as we're able to get all of the documents ready for posting. Thank you all for joining us today for the PIT Count Methodology Office Hours. We have a pretty full slate of things to discuss, as you can see from our agenda. I'm going to kick us off with some introductions and some housekeeping notes, and then William is going to lead part of our focus discussion, which for this office hours event is focused on a few different pieces in the PIT count planning process. And then after that, I'm going to walk you through a big picture overview of a new set of resources that we've been working on that really aim to support communities in training their volunteers to help conduct their PIT counts. And then finally, as is usual for these calls, we will end with time devoted to open Q&A on anything that you want to ask about the PIT count. I'm seeing some notes that people are having trouble hearing. We will hopefully be able to get to those in a second. Okay. So let's get started with our introductions. We've got William Snow from the SNAPS office at HUD on the line, and then Megan Henry and Ryan Watt, and this is Aubrey Sittler talking, all from Apt Associates, your TA providers. So those of you who have joined us on these calls before know that we tend to conduct them a little bit differently than most webinars. We'd like to encourage as much participation from the people in the audience as possible. So I'm going to go ahead and walk us through just a quick tutorial of how to use a few of the different features in this WebEx interface to make sure that you know how to use them. And for anybody who has audio trouble throughout this call, this image on the screen right now kind of shows you where to go to connect using a different medium. You can either use your computer or a phone to call in, but you need to go to the Quick Start menu up in this upper left-hand corner of the screen, and then go to Audio Conference, and you can make a couple of different selections from there. Okay, so then there are a few different icons that you will see in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, and they say things like participants, chat, Q&A, polling, etc. You can click to turn the corresponding panels to those icons on and off. And if you click the little triangle in the corner, you'll see a list of additional icons that you can click. We're going to use all of these panels today, so just wanted to make sure you're familiar with how to use them. There's another little arrow in the corner of all of the panels that you can use to expand them and collapse them. I know sometimes it's easier to see the bigger version or the smaller version, depending on what you're looking for. If you're having any technical difficulties at all, please send a chat, not a Q&A, to hosts and presenters. You can see that there's a little drop down there that gives you a list of different people that you can send chats to. Ryan or I will message you back to hopefully help you figure out that technical issue. But if you send it to hosts and all presenters, then you'll have a higher likelihood of getting a quick response. When it gets to the point in our conversation where we're trying to have a discussion, if you would like to ask a question verbally or offer a comment verbally, please use this hand-raising icon that you'll see at the bottom of your participants panel. That'll alert us to the fact that you have something you want to say, and I can go ahead and unmute you and ask for your comment or question. And if you prefer to write written questions or comments on any of the things that we're talking about, feel free to use the Q&A panel. So I know that that's a lot of information to keep track of. I often use this slide to pull up again when we get to the open Q&A part or the discussion part, just to remind people of what these features are and how to use them. So you'll see this guy a little bit later. Okay, William, let's go over to you to start our conversation about PIT count planning.
All right. Excited to meet with everyone again. It's kind of crazy because we're still like ramping up to do the follow-up from the last PIT count. So to have this conversation, I'm glad we're having it. It's nice to do the office hours quarterly, but it's always one of those kind of funny deals where we just finished and now we're jumping into the next one already. So that's the fun of doing counts and working with data. I want to just cover two things. I want to spend some time on mobile apps. We talked a little bit about it last time, and there was a lot of interest. So let's start with a poll question. Did your COC use a mobile app to conduct the PIT count this year? Let's start with that one. Again, that should be available for everyone to answer. I know in my screen it's on the right-hand side.
Yeah, so it looks like we've got some responses coming in from about 70%. We'll wait till we have at least 80, hopefully, and then we'll close it.
Cool.
All right, you got 15 more seconds.
All right, let's see what the responses are. So it looks like 42 out of the 182 said yes. We had about 80, so nearly half said no, some not sures, and then not applicable. So that's actually a pretty good chunk that did do it. It's kind of exciting to see that this is a technology that we're able to access and use. So let's ask a quick follow-up question, and this question applies to those who used it last year and those thinking about it, so this applies really to everybody. And the question is, does your COC plan to use a mobile app to conduct your PIT count in the next year? Again, as you're answering this, what we'll go over in a few minutes is some of the lessons learned. There's a lot of positive feedback. There's a little bit on the challenges side, so we'll raise that as well. HUD's in a fun place of we strongly encourage the use of apps is most certainly not required, but the benefits we're seeing from it show that it's a good thing in most areas. There's also a cost component and whatnot. We can't recommend a vendor. It's similar to the HMIS space. We are not allowed to endorse vendors. For the purposes of how you contract or do any of that. There certainly are quite a few out there, and you have different options about who could provide what apps. We recommend that you engage with peer communities to the extent you can. We had looked into whether or not we can share that information about who's done it. We haven't been able to do that on our website yet, but I'd encourage folks to chime in the chat or the Q&A box to say if you're willing to talk with other communities. If you used an app last year, that would be great. Chat would probably be ideal for that. So let's see where we came out. Does your COC plan in the future? So last year, we had a response of 42 out of the 186 on the call that said yes, and now that's those planning, it's up to about 69. So we have certainly more communities thinking about it. Only 20 said no, and then a good chunk who aren't sure. But it looks like there's an increasing interest in using mobile apps. Again, that's exciting. So hopefully we can walk you through a couple things to think about in considering mobile apps. All right. Let me jump into those kind of lessons learned. So from the many communities I've talked to, I've only had one community that shared with me that they don't plan on using a mobile app again, and it wasn't because they didn't like it or it was dysfunctional. It actually was because their COC was small enough and the nature of their count was small enough that the app didn't provide a value added, but it provided a little more work for them on the setup and some extra cost. And so they just felt like from a cost-benefit analysis, it just wasn't worth it. Again, that's only one community. I've probably talked over time to 30-ish, 30, 35 communities about their experience. And the rest have all said, we loved it. And these are the various reasons that I have recorded as to why they thought it was beneficial. So I'll kind of go through. I have 8 core ones that I'll highlight. So benefit number one, data collection was faster. This was largely because you had a platform that walked the volunteer through the process as opposed to the volunteer just trying to figure out on paper and what questions you ask and what questions you omit, right? We're all comfortable with phones, or many of us are, and so it actually resulted in a speedier engagement with folks. Number two, the app allowed COCs to count more people. This was tied to the speed piece. So they were just able to engage, again, more because they were able to go through all the surveys faster. This applied more to the larger areas where there were lots of people to engage with. So I just wanted to put that note. Not to say that other areas couldn't or didn't experience that, but I noticed it most with areas who had lots of people to engage with at a single time and kind of in their line of sight. It allowed people to geotag. That's an obvious big benefit, is the ability to say, hey, I saw them here, and rather than try to go through a process of writing down the street or anything like that, which most people did not do outside of the mobile app, you can pin them, pin the spot where people are, which is fantastic and allows you to do all sorts of analysis later. Benefit number four, it allowed greater capacity to run reports. So not only did you add this tab on geotags, but also allowed people to move very quickly in aggregating reports so that you could do things faster in terms of reports, but also more. So you could use the geotag in particular to look at regions and to look at places where the data was commonly incomplete. And you can get a sense of, is that a volunteer issue, or is that kind of a volunteer leader issue, or a training issue based on where people were located? It just allowed a more rich analysis of both the training process and the engagement process, which I thought was interesting, and that was very positive because we certainly want to get at the quality pieces. Number five that we saw was real-time feedback. A lot of the folks that use the mobile app set up something akin to a command center where information would feed in to the COC during the count, and the folks leading the command center could address questions, but also be proactive. If they saw high missing rates for certain response categories, they could engage the volunteers. They could call them or the volunteer leader and say, what's going on? We're seeing that we're missing things. Is there confusion about questions that need to be answered? So it allowed a lot more real-time engagement, which we really haven't seen much of that in the past, so it's exciting to see that option. Benefit number six, there was better subpopulation. Again, this was partly due to the ability to engage people real-time, so if veteran questions or disability questions that were tied to chronic status were not answered, it allowed the team to engage quicker so that we could kind of troubleshoot whatever was stopping or preventing them from getting complete information. So that, again, also very exciting. Benefit number seven, it was easier for volunteers. I kind of mentioned that earlier with number one. Most people are very familiar with mobile apps and surveys, and it's nice to have something that really guides you through the process. You don't have to think twice about what questions you ask. The app does all the work. You ask this question and you do it in this order, and they don't even know what questions they have to skip because they don't see them. So volunteers tended to like it. The last one that I wanted to note was it helps with future planning. That can be done in two ways. You can look at how the app was used in your most recent count and kind of look at where were hot spots, or back to the training issue, what were things that appear to be a problem, not because of the technology, but because of how people were engaging with the technology or engaging the population, right? So if volunteers weren't asking all the questions, it allowed folks to kind of know that real hand. You could also use the technology in preparation for the future in using other forms of outreach and apps that a lot of you are already doing ahead of the count. So drafting up hotspots a month before the count, identifying where many people are and working with your law enforcement and seeing where you should count, well, this is a great opportunity for you to put that, kind of test the waters of that in the app and see where did people end up aggregating or congregating on the night of the count. And you can kind of engage a little early, but then use the app to plan on how many volunteers should go to what type of locations and things like that. So that was kind of exciting, a lot of good things. That's not all the good things. There's a lot of opportunities for communities to have flexibility in what they add to it for local question purposes, local needs, and other things. So let me move, though, to a few challenges. There were 3 main challenges that we saw. So one of them was understanding who was creating your app and the back-end piece. So we had one community who had worked hard to get the app up and going, and unfortunately, their server died out on them that night, and then the backup server died out as well. So they ended up having to redo their count, and that was painful. A lot of scare there. So that was not a great thing. I will say that was tied to a homegrown app as opposed to ones we've seen more off the shelf. I heard another similar story that was also tied to a locally created mobile app. So I would just encourage folks, just be a little cautious if you're going to go and create your own, which is not a problem in any way as long as you're doing all that you need to ensure the privacy exists and also to ensure that you have any backup server capacity that you may need. So that was just one major note of caution. Another one was using the app ahead of time to test the questions. Folks do that often with a regular survey, but just making sure that the right questions are firing, so we're relying very heavily on the right logic. That should certainly be tested before you go out to make sure people are getting the right question. And then another variation on that testing principle is load testing. On the night of the count, you're going to have a lot of people using it. So just make sure that whatever back-end server you're using can handle the load you're talking about. That wasn't a huge issue. Most did not have a problem there, but it's worth testing. A few had some slowdown that they weren't expecting because of that. So those are the 3, although I will say one other piece is a few communities struggle a little bit because they couldn't change the questions that are HUD required questions because they were working with. And so that's something, negotiations you have to make with your provider for that. So just think about that, how you ask, again, the HUD required questions and whether or not you can have flexibility in changing the wording a little bit. So those are the major pieces that I wanted to just highlight on mobile apps. I think what we'll do is we'll save questions and we'll address them all at the end. I think that's probably going to be easiest, unless there's something in the chat or Q&A. Aubrey, is there anything in the
There are a couple of Q&As, yeah, that I can pitch to you real quick. I don't think they'll take too long. So why don't we go ahead and touch on those ones right now while we're on the apps.
Cool.
Okay, so one person asked, is the mobile app being used for providers to complete or are clients completing surveys on their own cellular device using an app?
Oh, great question. There's a couple variations on this. The apps that I have seen can be used both in a sheltered and unsheltered context. And in the unsheltered, I've seen it used for observation and interview-based counts. So in short, they can do everything. I have not seen communities use it much on the shelter side. But generally, HMIS does enough of the work that it's not worth the cost to do that. Not to say no one did it, but it just wasn't very common. So most people were using it for unsheltered. And in that engagement, it was the volunteer's device most of the time. A few communities were able to get donations of tablets and phones that they could use on the night of the count. So that was rare. More often than not, again, it was volunteers who were downloading the app on their phone and then engaging with folks experiencing homelessness on the night of. I didn't hear of them like handing them their phone. That actually is an option based on the comfort level and security of the volunteer with their app. I don't see any problem as long as we're confident that whoever receives it, A, will feel like this is a more secure or private way to provide their information, and that you can be somehow confident that they are able to read and understand the questions. Those are some huge assumptions. So for the most part, volunteers are holding their phone, asking the questions as they go. But again, I don't want to take off the table the opportunity to hand over the device and let the person you're talking to actually just answer the questions, read them and answer them.
Great, thanks. And just to clarify to the person who asked that question, in the same way that you should never be just like listing a link somewhere for anybody to be able to fill out a pit count survey and count it as a valid pit count survey, you should not be letting people download an app at their own will to complete a survey on their own. It should always be administered by somebody who is assessing them for whether or not they meet the definition of experiencing homelessness to then conduct the survey with them.
Yeah, great reminder. Thank you.
Okay, so one other question. This person says that they would like some feedback on mobile apps and if they're able to conduct the questions offline and submit later. So I imagine this is in reference to whether or not the actual interface is able to save the data that's collected onto a phone for then upload to a server or whatever else later. And they said this would make it easier to be able to use it in rural areas like Vermont where there's not necessarily good service everywhere.
Yeah, nearly every mobile app I've seen has both capacities. They generally have a downloadable format and a web-based. Most don't use the web-based. They end up using the downloadable, but it's optional for both. And especially with the downloadable, it'll save where you are, so you don't need internet connection. When you go back and get internet connection, then you can upload that data to the larger server, wherever the surveys are going for the COC's purposes. So most apps have that capability, and even though you're not tied to the internet, generally you can do the geocoding so you can still drop the pin where people are, and it'll still save it at the location you are, even if it's not, even if you don't have internet there. So it's, yeah, most apps can accommodate that, which we're thrilled to see.
Great. Okay, and then we'll just do one more right now, and then a bunch of the other ones that I'm seeing are more general questions that I think we can wait to answer until the general Q&A later in this call. So this person has asked, are you able to share the name of the apps that are being used? It seems like there are different ones from different vendors, and William, I don't know if you're able to say that or if you just want to encourage other people to put into the chat the names of the vendors they've worked with.
Yeah, I'd rather have folks just put it in the chat. I'm aware of a few, but it's not comprehensive, and again, I have to be careful a little bit on the endorsement side. But if you've used an app, please share what you used in the chat box, and if you have anything that you would say, even if it's just a thumbs up, thumbs down, people like to know that stuff as well. Seeing that most were thumbs up, you don't necessarily need to do that, but you certainly can. So we'd appreciate you sharing.
And also thanks to everybody who's shared their experiences with their mobile apps in the chat. I think it's really helpful for people to be able to kind of process that in that way, even if HUD and the TA providers are not able to endorse anything specifically.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, we really appreciate that.
All right, should we move on, William?
Yeah, so I want to make this piece quick. Again, I mentioned we just really finished the last count in terms of data collection and reporting it to HUD. We're already on to the next one. In our timeline that we had published a few years ago, we had recommended that folks get started around August. I know that actually varies by the nature of COCs and how intense the engagement is. So I just wanted to ask via poll where people are, just to see, are people already starting to do their count? And I don't want to go much further than that. I'd rather spend time on your questions. But let's ask that question. So the poll is open now. Have you begun planning your 2020 pit count?
We'll give folks about 15 more seconds.
We know not everyone's going to count in 2020. We have about a little over 80% of communities tend to count on an off year, and 2020 is not a required year. So while we encourage it, it's not a requirement to do an unsheltered count in 2020.
All right, you should be able to see the results. Are you guys able to see those?
Yep, looks like about a quarter of folks have already started. And then we have a variation of no and not sure for the rest. So yeah, that's a lot. That's exciting. Again, a big work. So this is one of the reasons we do this more quarterly based point in time count office hours, so that we don't leave you in the lurch for most of the year. So hopefully you'll be able to ask some questions, and we're excited to be able to answer them. But before we get there, we'll jump into the next piece. We want to make sure we're giving you tools that are helpful, and Aubrey and Megan and I and others have talked with folks like you guys in the communities and talked elsewhere and try to brainstorm what is it that we could provide to you that could be helpful to maybe reduce some of the load short of getting rid of the count altogether. So just trying to brainstorm what resources could we provide to help you. So this is some of the results of that type of conversation and your feedback. And so I'll turn it over to Aubrey to show us where we're going with that.
Great, thanks, William. So as William said, we are constantly thinking about ways to provide tools or resources or guidance that can help with your PIT count, because at the end of the day, the PIT count data that you guys collect and that we have on the nation as a whole are really only as good as the information that is collected on the night of the PIT count. So over the last couple of years at this point, we've been developing a new set of resources that we're referring to as the PIT Count Volunteer Training Toolkit. And that has come on the heels of hearing from providers and COCs across the country that either they do train their volunteers, but they do have volunteers who come out for their PIT counts and help them to conduct their PIT counts, but they would like some assistance in figuring out ways to improve those trainings. As well as folks who are like, hey, we would really love to use volunteers for our PIT count, but we really don't have the capacity to develop this whole set of resources to make sure they're doing the best job that we would need them to do in order to be able to rely on that data. So in developing this toolkit, we looked through a whole range of resources that we got from a number of communities across the country, and that includes some of the bigger urban cities in the U.S., as well as some suburban locations and a few more rural areas to see, well, how do you guys train your volunteers? What are some of the challenges you face in training volunteers? We also talked with people who have participated as volunteers in PIT counts before to understand what they thought their trainings that they had undergone had done really well to really prepare them to go out and talk to people and complete surveys with strangers who may be sleeping in unsheltered locations, and to understand, well, what did you wish that you had known before going out to do this for the first time? And so we arrived, the current iteration of the PIT Count Volunteer Training Toolkit has 4 files in it. One is a trainer's guide, which I like to refer to as the teacher's version of the textbook. It provides kind of an overview of the entire toolkit. There's a sample volunteer training slide deck. I know that developing content to present to volunteers can be one of the biggest barriers to training them in the first place. So we've developed a 47-slide PowerPoint file that could be used in your community. And then there's a sample volunteer refresher handout and a sample list of local resources. And so we're not going to go into all of these resources in depth today, but I will touch on each one more specifically in the next couple of slides. In general, each one is meant to be customized. As you can imagine, there is literally no possible way to develop something that is going to be usable in its original state by every possible continuum of care in the United States. You guys are too diverse to be able to do that. And so we plan to release each of the final versions of these files in formats that would be editable, so Word docs and PowerPoint files, because they are really meant to be customized. Okay, so the first one that I'm going to give you an overview of is this trainer's guide, which again is the teacher's version of the textbook, if you will. And as you can see from the table of contents here to the right, it's divided up into different parts with one part devoted to each of the tools that comprises the toolkit. It's organized by toolkit file, and it also includes links to some other pit count resources, as well as an appendix that has some tips and some help with using some of the PowerPoint features that are built into the sample slide deck. And within each of the parts that focuses on the different tools that are part of the toolkit, it provides a full explanation of what that particular tool is supposed to do, how to use it, how to customize it, and the different places where it's built in for communities to be able to customize those specific tools. The sample slide deck, like I said, it's 47 total slides right now, and it is geared mainly toward continuums that use volunteers for their unsheltered pit count activities. It could be pretty easily restructured to fit into a sheltered pit count for volunteers, but the biggest need that we've heard from COCs is that they really want to be able to use volunteers for their unsheltered pit counts. Again, I want to keep reiterating, it is entirely intended to be customized, so it is customizable. We've used the notes pane in PowerPoint. If you look at this screenshot to the right here, you can see the notes pane at the bottom. They've got these little info symbols next to them. There are descriptions next to the little info symbols of what the slide is and what the intention of its contents are supposed to be. Now, this particular slide that you're looking at doesn't have these other symbols on it, but there are several slides in the sample slide deck that have this little, it looks kind of like a little chat bubble, like a cartoon, and it has sample scripts to use during the training to explain some of the slide contents. And we use those for things like explaining why is the pit count at the end of January, or why do we have to do a pit count, or why do I have to ask the survey questions in the way that they're phrased. Things that should be able to help communities to explain common questions that people have without having to come up with, their own explanations necessarily if they don't want to. And then there's this little document symbol, and throughout the PowerPoint slides, that would include links to other relevant resources or references, such as the notice, or the pit count methodology guide, or the model survey tools that we post on the HUD Exchange that are kind of like the baseline of what you could use to collect your pit count information. Also throughout the sample slide deck, there are slides that have red text in them, and that was how we denoted things that must be customized for each continuum. And that's things that pertain to, for example, whether you're using a full census methodology, whether you're walking every street in your continuum, then that's going to require a different explanation than if you're using a hotspot methodology or something like that. And so the last thing that I would say about this right now, I think, is the slide that I chose to use a screenshot of is the agenda. So you can see how this training is structured and what the different parts that it goes through are. So it starts with a Pit Count 101 that really goes through the volunteer-focused background of what is a pit count and why do we do one and what are the commonly asked questions about it. And then there's an overview of the volunteer's role in the pit count, which includes everything from an introduction to the actual survey tool and how to do interviews, where volunteers are expected to go, how they will know where to go, and who they should interview while they are out conducting a pit count. And of course, safety, the safety of both the volunteers themselves as well as the people they are interviewing. And then there's an entire section dedicated to what I refer to as survey practice. So that's setting people up to be able to practice going through the survey with other volunteers at the training so that they can start to get comfortable asking questions that we, quite frankly, are not accustomed to asking strangers with any frequency. And then the last piece is all about the logistics. And that can obviously be catered to continuums that want to conduct this training before the night designated for the count. And it can also be structured for those who want to conduct it right before on the night dedicated for the pit count. And so that would include things like what you recommend volunteers bring with them, the schedule of events for the night, what time they should plan to be back, where they need to go, and then an open Q&A for people to kind of talk through what lingering questions they might have. And so I think this is probably the biggest piece of this toolkit. Everything else is it kind of wraps around this idea of the training, of actually offering a comprehensive training to volunteers. And so the last two documents that we'll talk about, just very briefly, one is a sample resource guide, and it's currently 8 total pages. The first 6 pages are lists of examples of resources that you could possibly choose to include in a one-page or maybe front and back page handout that you would have volunteers bring with them on the night designated for the pit count, so that if they want to make a call somewhere with somebody they encounter, or if they want to hand these resources out to the people they encounter, they could do that. And then the last page of the resource guide includes the screenshot that you see here, which is a formatted one-page document that, as you can see, you can fit a whole bunch of information on. And, you know, we're aware different communities have different levels of resources. Your community may not have this many resources, so the idea of having to fit them all into one single page is maybe not as daunting of a task for you, but I know that the formatting piece can be a barrier to some folks, so we decided to include this as an example of how you could fit a whole bunch of information onto a small space. And then the last resource that we're going to talk about today is what we're referring to as a sample refresher handout. So the intention of this is that you would hand it to volunteers after they have completed their pit count training, and they would be able to either carry it with them on the night of the count, or if you're training them well before the night of the count, they'd be able to kind of consult it before they go back out to remember, what are the big points that I need to take with me while I am out and doing this tonight? I've seen some COCs that have put together full, like very comprehensive guidebooks for volunteers, which is great. The intention behind this, though, was that it was something quick and accessible. So the current format of it, as you can see, it's literally a one-page document. So you're looking at the whole current draft of it right now. The whole point of it is that it's small and it's accessible. So if you have suggestions on things like the format of that and whether you think that it should be smaller, maybe a quarter page or a half page, you know, that's the type of feedback that we would definitely want to hear about that. But in general, this is, at its current point, meant to be just a very brief example of the type of thing that you could hand to a volunteer to take with them. So I'm going to pause there, and I'm going to give you guys a new poll. I know that that was a very quick introduction and that you did not get the chance to dive into the contents of this toolkit very heavily. But just thinking about the idea of having a volunteer training toolkit, is that something that you think your COC would use to either develop new volunteer training materials or to update existing ones if you guys already conduct a volunteer training? Let me give people a little bit more time. But I mean, at the end of the day, I think the main point is that we want to develop tools that people will use. And the content, as you can see at the bottom of this slide, we really want to hear some feedback on the content and the structure of what we have developed before we release it, to make sure that it is meeting the need that you all have. I'll give you guys about 20 more seconds to finish answering the poll. But after this session, I will reach out to everybody who attended, and this is not, we're still trying to figure out the best ways to get feedback on the full toolkit. We definitely want the feedback of everybody who was present for this session. So after this office hours call, we're going to reach out with an email that has some of the sample files attached and a survey to seek your feedback on the current draft. Let's see what people said. Okay, so it looks like only one person said that they would not, absolutely not use this training toolkit, which is great. That means that we're at least in the right direction, I hope. And there were several who said not sure. There's one person who's not from a COC, but 117 different people had said that they would find this useful. Okay, so let's pause there and see if there are questions. I know Ryan has been looking at them. Ryan, do you want to pitch a couple of the questions that people have been asking?
Yeah, there have been a couple of questions about this toolkit in particular. So one is asking, will there be specific resources available for rural communities?
That's a great question. William, do you want to speak to that, or do you want me to speak to that first?
I can take a crack at it. I think the short answer is not necessarily. I don't think there's anything in the toolkit now that would be limited or targeted necessarily to rural communities. That being said, we would welcome feedback on what it is that you would want in rural communities that might be different than would be urban communities in this context, right? What resources could be more helpful to you? We'd love that feedback. We would love to help rural communities and, well, all communities, but to provide specific resources if needed for different geographic types. So happy to meet that need if you can be a little more specific in the feedback process as to what it is you need.
Yep, that's exactly what I would have said. So when we send out that survey, specifically to the person who asked that question, anybody else who's wondering something similar, if you could make sure to include that kind of perspective of what you feel like it's missing, specifically from your region or continuum where you stand, that'd be great.
Great. We have 3 more brief questions about the toolkit. 2 of them, I think, are more suggestions about what should be included. One says, will a sample liability form be provided? In my previous work, we had volunteers sign a liability waiver. And then the other one on that subject says, I would like the schedule slide from earlier to be a part of the toolkit.
Cool. The schedule slide is actually available in different formats. We have a checklist form of the schedule online among the various tools, so that actually might be more useful to you as opposed to the slide, although I think it has something akin to the slide already. So that's public. You could already do that. The liability one is a tough one. At the end of the day, that's probably not going to happen, not because it's not needed, but because we don't think we can get something approved out of our office. So we've gone rounds on it. We've actually have a draft form of a liability waiver, and we've just never had success getting it out. So that's one where we would strongly encourage folks to kind of share with each other. I know I've seen a few folks willing to share. So please open up, if you have something like that, make it available to others to see what you've done. We really appreciate that.
Great, and I think this is sort of implicit in what you just said, William, but the last question about the toolkit is, do you want samples from any of our COCs? We have a good volunteer guide with photos produced by a local outreach and advocacy group. I'd be glad to send.
Yeah, I love that. That's from Susie, I believe. Thanks, Susie, for making that an option. In fact, if we could put that on the chat so others can see. HUD has a weird place if we can't really, or we're limited in what we can put on our website if we haven't reviewed it. And so if we had, 400 different pit count methodology packets and volunteer materials, we just wouldn't have the bandwidth to review every single one and quote-unquote approve them. So we haven't been able to do much with that, but again, that's kind of in the same vein of if you are willing to share what you have and just kind of know that that's from peers and they've worked hard on it, and that we strongly encourage that, and we appreciate any community who's willing to share.
Those are the only questions in the Q&A about the toolkit. We have a couple of broader questions, but I'll let Aubrey decide when those should come up.
And I am also looking through the chat. It seems like people are saying that they're not able to send chats to all attendees or all participants, and it looks like it's grayed out for you guys, and I'm sorry about that. I vaguely remember this happening in one of our other webinars, and I don't think we came up with a solution to it. So I'll have to look at the settings for the next one that we host. But again, I apologize for that. We'll try to kind of amplify what people have said by sending it out to the full group ourselves. So keep sending us that content, that's fine. Somebody just asked if anybody uses a video to train pit count volunteers, and do volunteers like that format? I know that there are continuums that do that. We obviously have not incorporated a video into our example, but that I participated in one as a volunteer, actually, that had us watch a video before we came to the event. But if you guys want to send examples through the chat, we can, again, amplify those to folks.
And I think, Aubrey, with that, that almost makes the most sense to do, if communities are looking at that, to have that refresher piece that we have in the toolkit.
Mm-hmm.
It's ideal if the training happened again on your own or happened weeks earlier, if you have that type of refresher, so you get there as a volunteer and you get handed this quick one-pager, beware, do this, don't do this type stuff. But it's not a full training. At the same time, all the core stuff you can hit on. So one reason we put that in there was just the reality that we know people are moving towards that online platform or towards earlier trainings, and it makes that piece that much more relevant.
Yeah. I'm also seeing a question from somebody who said that for them, the unsheltered PIC count serves very medically vulnerable populations, and they're wondering if the draft toolkit includes instructions on ensuring that people in need of services are offered assistance and not just enumerated. And I have two things to say in response to that. The first is that, yes, so I mentioned safety is, if we go back to that slide with the overview, safety is included under the your role as a volunteer section of the sample training. And the first part of safety is about the safety of the volunteers who are conducting the PIC count, because they're often concerned about their own safety, especially people who haven't, gone out and talked to strangers on the street before. Often are a little more nervous than the people who have done this before. But then the second part of it is the safety of the people they're interviewing, and it includes space for each continuum to kind of customize based on their climate, based on the population that they tend to serve, and the kinds of vulnerabilities that they see in people, how to instruct volunteers of who to call, when to call. So, for example, somebody who decides that they want shelter for the night, is there a way for them to get shelter that night? If they see somebody who appears to be in incredible medical danger, always call 911. How to assess in colder climates for things like hypothermia, or to assess whether somebody is just really deeply asleep or really in danger. And so a lot of that we rely on continuums to have the expertise for, but there's definitely space in here that is dedicated to that. So thanks for asking that question. I do think that's an important piece of the volunteer training. Ryan, are there any other questions that you think we need to pitch right now, or should we move on to more general Q&A?
I think we can do both. I think there's a couple of more general questions that we can pitch now.
Okay.
There are two questions, in fact, about coordination with the 2020 federal census. One specifically asks, are you coordinating in any way for the 2020 U.S. Census count? It's only a few weeks later, so I'm wondering if there's any coordination when it comes to counting people experiencing homelessness for both purposes. And then a second question that is about the same topic.
I can definitely speak to that. We've been working with the census over a couple of weeks and months trying to figure out how we should proceed. So there's a few things to think about in relation to that. First, we've gotten questions about will HUD grant exceptions to the timeline to coordinate with the census instead of, in lieu of doing that, the unsheltered count. Unfortunately, the answer is no. We've looked at that. We've looked at their timeline. The problem is that it's their timeline for the unsheltered engagement piece is like the last, I want to say last week or last couple of days in March and going into April. Because of our requirement to get the information out to our congressional folks as tied to our appropriations and our statutory stuff, and because once you start to get into March, or really April, your count looks different than it would if you compare your count to everyone else's who's in January. So we decided to not grant exceptions to go that late for the census engagement. That being said, it's an off-year count. So if you choose to not do an unsheltered count and instead decide look, we're going to engage with the census and do the count a few weeks later. It won't be officially counted for HUD's purposes, but we'll use it. We'll use the effort we would normally do in the PID count to engage the census. We have no problem with that. We think engaging with the census is extremely valuable and important. So I want to start with that because that's going to be the first question we get is, are there exceptions? And the short answer is no. In our talking with them about what counting the homeless means, we asked for some clarification. So this is how they are describing their methodology for engaging the homeless populations. They're referring to the count of the homeless as a service-based enumeration. That includes kind of 4 key areas of engagement on their part, going to shelters and transitional housing, going to soup kitchens specifically, going with regular scheduled mobile food vans, and I guess there's the 5th one is actually their targeted unsheltered or non-sheltered outdoor locations. So they have these things. That's different than what we call a service-based count. They're actually including what we would normally count as everything. They're including that all and expanding who they reach to, again, mobile food vans and the way they engage soup kitchens. They have, again, a lot of data or a lot of information already on the web, and we'll put more information out about this, about how they do that count. One of our immediate questions to them was, how are you going to share this information, the data that you glean? Because we're not sure how comprehensive. I mean, they said up front, we're not trying to do a comprehensive unsheltered PID count. Their response was, we're not planning on releasing this data. So they'll collect on the homeless population, but they're not going to release it either nationally or locally. So that's important context for you guys to have if you decide not to do a PID count because you're going to lean on that and hopefully be able to reference it. You won't be able to reference it. That's not going to be an option because they're not going to publish it. The other piece there is we have encouraged them to engage COCs. We have specifically asked them not to go and just kind of cold call whoever they think is leading the homeless effort locally, which folks leading it have various views about who that might be. So we've asked that they centralize that by contacting the COCs. As part of that, we also asked a follow-up of, so what incentives do we have for the COCs? It's obviously important to get a comprehensive count, but we're also want to recognize that there's time involved and resources involved. We asked specifically, is there some sort of stipend or anything like that? They haven't responded to us on that yet, so we'll continue to ask whether or not there's a stipend. They actually have stipends for a lot of different types of the engagement, so I just don't know what that means. If I were you, I wouldn't hold your breath about getting the stipend, but we just figured it's fair to ask, and they shouldn't. You shouldn't have to ask them. We should be able to ask them for you. So we have done that, and again, we'll publish information as we receive it. So we'll put out more information on our listserv as we get closer to the count about what that means and some of the possible fears. There are a lot of FAQs that Census has already put out about privacy and security, about various pieces that concern our population in particular. And so we have asked them to coordinate with us so that we can share that with all of you, and you can share it with those experiencing homelessness and your providers and whoever is interested. But we definitely want to get as many people involved as possible.
Great. Thanks, William. We have a couple of questions from people about summer PID counts conducted in the summer in general, but also there's one in particular that's saying, can we merge a housing survey with an existing annual large-scale youth event and count it for our PID numbers even though it is not in January? And they're asking specifically about the youth portion of the count. So it sounds like there's some kind of event where they feel like they're getting a better estimate maybe or a better count of the youth experiencing homelessness in their continuum, but it does not fall at the same within the last 10 days of January.
It would depend on when it is. It would depend on how comprehensive it is. It would depend on the overlap, kind of what are you talking about in engaging them, how comprehensive is the engagement. So the short answer is it depends. that's an AAQ, or you can shoot me even an email. I don't mind that at all, and happy to engage in that conversation. But I would, if you do that, which I encourage you to, be prepared to provide those details. And again, that first one of when, if you say October, the answer is no. If you say March, the answer is probably not, but not impossibly no, but probably not. So it'd have to be still have to be kind of in the winter time frame, in the early part of the year. But again, the other questions also bear weight, and so I want to think about those. So those are just things to think about.
Great. So another summertime question. We're conducting a summer pit count, and due to our geography, we are seeing an influx of migrants coming through shelters. Is there a different category designation if they are in an emergency shelter but on their way to family in another location?
No,
this
not
sounds less like a pit count question, but more of like an HMIS designation question.
Yeah. So no, we don't. The last thing you guys want us to do is create 50 variations on an emergency shelter, because we could be, we could add navigation centers and we can add all sorts of variations. So we intentionally don't do that, but you can certainly add elements to your system. The main piece there is to kind of determine, are they actually homeless? Does this look much more like a vacation concept, even though it's, so that there's a couple things you'll have to grapple with locally on that one, but you'll probably have to customize your system if you are trying to collect that very specific population information.
Okay, we've got another mobile app question, William. It says, for mobile apps, how can we confirm that the app provider meets the HUD privacy guidance? They had an issue with this last year, apparently.
That's a good question. You can refer them to the limited information we have on privacy, which ties into, again, the ability to keep the data secure and, well, there's a bunch to privacy. But, yeah, you can refer them to our guidance that's already out on the HMIS side. That all generally applies in this context. I will say that having a mobile app has natural challenges in terms of privacy, right? Often, especially if it's a downloadable app, you have records residing on people's phones. So the vendor should be able to speak to how the record comes in, how long it stays, what is the transfer point that it goes to the COC's database, and then when is the record destroyed for all intents and purposes on the phone. Those are things, when we beta tested several years ago, those are certainly things we looked at, and they continue to be things we would strongly encourage COCs to ask questions about when they're considering a vendor. Great, thanks. Looking through, so I'll just remind folks, I haven't seen anybody use the hand-raising feature yet. If you want to verbally ask any questions, feel free to click that little hand. You can pull that slide up again. Click little hand that has a purple circle around it underneath or at the very bottom of the Participants tab. We do like to hear your voices. We feel less like we're talking to ourselves that way. Okay, so somebody has asked in the Q&A about observation counts. They want us to please cover the acceptable methods. For example, if a person walks away mid-survey, or if somebody in an encampment runs away when a pit count enumerator approaches them. That's a good question. So we actually give a lot of flexibility to you at the COC level on that. You have the ability to determine when you have an interview-based survey that's merely incomplete, or when you need to move to an observation, especially if you're using an app. Most of the times it'll have both options handy and available, so you can even switch mid-app if I remember right. And with paper, you certainly would want to carry probably both types of forms, observation and the interview one. But again, I would look to completeness to make that decision. We allow, again, on COCs to make a lot of decisions about what that means. as long as you're able to do the extrapolation. The very worst option is to throw out a record, period. So if you know or have a good sense from your limited engagement that they are homeless, or have every reason to believe it based on the observation, then please don't throw out the record. At least choose the observation and then extrapolate to account for the other details that you're required to submit to us.
Great. And there are a few questions from people asking about if there are any tips or guidance around how to count people who are sleeping in cars without waking them up in the middle of the night.
The short answer is no, in that I would say if you're going to count people in cars, you're going to have to wake some of them up in order for you to do a sample, because that's a unique population. Often folks living in cars do not look the same as the others. So this would be similar to what you would do with a normal sample. You would have to derive a sample based on known information. Even with the unsheltered population, if you do an observation-based count, you still have to do a sample at some point of that population. So if you have a way of sampling those who are sleeping in vehicles as kind of a post-night follow-up, that's acceptable, but you would have to have some sort of sample. So if you did that post-night follow-up, let's say you have a parking program, safe parking program, and you know that's where a lot of people are sleeping, you could do a follow-up perhaps in the next day or so and ask folks, again, the demographic type stuff. That way you're not waking them up. The one caveat there is do you have any reason to believe that a part of the vehicular homeless population does not look like who's sleeping in the safe parking programs? I mean, that's the same type of theory we have with the unsheltered population. There are different folks like to sleep in different types of areas, and you know, they're just things to watch out for. We worked with San Diego this year. San Diego did a lot to identify those sleeping in vehicles, and we commend them for their effort, but it was challenging as well, and they have a lot of people sleeping in vehicles, and they implemented a sample approach so that they were engaging a limited number of people, waking them up or knocking on doors, but not everyone. So, and then using that sample to apply to all vehicles that they identified.
Great. Thanks for that, William. And I know we've been asked in the past, too, about whether there's like a standard multiplier that is suggested to be used for if you see that there is clearly somebody sleeping in the car, if you should be assuming that it's one person or two people or whatever else. And the answer that we always give is no, there's not a standard multiplier. So I know that's come up in the AAQ several times over the last few years.
That's a good point, because that actually is exactly why we want you to do the sample. We want you to find out what does your community look like, not even your neighboring community. What is your COC's vehicular homeless community, or any part of your COC? If you're ever using multipliers, we want you to base the multiplier on a sample within your COC and during this period of time, right? Don't use the multiplier from October if you're counting the homeless in January.
Right. So one person has asked about, they've said they're from Dallas, and they say that Dallas wants to create a pit count committee to help coordinate the event. Who would you suggest be on that committee? And William, if you want to start answering that, and I can also pull up that planning worksheet that I've sent in the chat a few times with a link to that had that timeline that we talked about at the beginning of the call, because I know it speaks to that in the August section, so I can show that on the screen.
That's a great question. It depends partly on how you structure your counts, especially if you do a youth separate count, because often youth should be involved in that. We would encourage you to engage people experiencing homeless as part of whatever committee you do, and we've seen the most success in the work with homeless youth, both in planning pit counts as well as service engagement. So definitely would say if you're including youth in that larger committee, or you're going to count the youth on that and not do a separate youth count, include someone from the youth side. I would just look at your local dynamics, right? If you're in Arizona and you're close to reservations, I would see if you can get tribal participation. I know there are several states or areas where they either have tribal lands or there's a heavy urban tribal presence. And so that's another thing to consider. Engage your board. So sometimes people don't think of having board members on. They kind of have their HMIS lead or a data lead be on that and kind of have a small committee. We would encourage you to have at least one COC board member, partly because they're the ones who, at the end of the day, are responsible, but we also want them engaged in doing the count and being out there. Many of you have board members who are steeped in the work, and that's not a difficulty. So other than that, I think looking at what Aubrey's put up already is actually probably helpful. There's all sorts of people you can engage, but at some point there's too many cooks in the kitchen. And so just finding out your core groups and then making sure, again, have someone from your COC board, have somebody with lived experience, and then find out who's going to lead the effort. You definitely want that. And this is a good place to insert an intern or somebody who's temporary, who can have the kind of the passion to rile people, as long as they have someone behind them who has the experience to answer questions and the experience to say, yeah, we need to engage people and we do this in the PID count. So this is a good place to maybe get a little help from interns, but don't foist it all on them, because they generally are not prepared to take on the whole effort.
I think, too, it's important to keep in mind what it is you want your PID count committee to accomplish. If it's something like overhauling your entire methodology, then that's going to require a different group of people with a different group of experience than, for example, somebody who's trying to get the word out and trying to, like William was saying, rile the community and bringing passion to it. So keeping the ultimate outcome of those conversations or that committee in mind will inform who you invite to the table too. Okay, so we've got somebody asking if their mobile app is HIPAA compliant, is that also in compliance with HUD's privacy rules?
Very likely, yes. Because HIPAA tends to be a higher standard, certainly a different standard, but a higher standard for what we require. So yes, typically.
Great. Okay, and so for the people who are asking for the link to this worksheet, I've sent it, I think, 3 different times in the chat now. And it should have been sent to all participants. So again, go up to that upper right-hand corner of your screen and make sure that the thing that says chat is blue, and then open up that panel to see where that link is. You can also just Google PID count planning worksheet or search for it in the HUD Exchange, and it should pop up and is one of the first options. Okay.
I see.
There's 2 I see, yeah, in the Q&A that have not been answered.
Are you looking at Michael Chapman's one about the extrapolation tool?
That's right, and Melissa McWhinney's question about the youth count.
Oh,
yeah, so I have a follow-up question for Michael, though, and I'm wondering what about the extrapolation tool, Michael, you were hoping would be updated. I don't know if you'd feel comfortable if I unmuted you, or if you'd prefer to just submit a new Q&A clarifying what you wanted to be updated. I know in the past we've talked about extrapolating for people when you don't know their household type. I know that's not accounted for in the extrapolation tool. But other than that, it would be helpful to hear a little bit more clarification. There he is. Okay, I'm going to unmute you, Michael.
Hello.
Hi, Michael.
So I was just wondering about the extrapolation tool. If there's going to be an update for any changes with data elements that are collected in PIT, and of course we got HIC and the infamous LSA and all of that. So the extrapolation tool is important to us because we get a number of cases with people that we survey that may be families with children, and they won't provide the children's information. They may say, we have 3 children. And that's about all we get. We may get the race, we may get an age, but not an actual birth date, so, you know, those demographics. It's tough to call, you know, to include all of that, and which ones to accept the data and which ones to disallow the data as part of the count. So on, you know, for the sake of accuracy. So I'm just wondering if you know, there's going to be an update to that extrapolation tool.
So I think there's 2 parts to that question. One is, are we changing anything in 2020? That's actually one of the questions. That's probably a bigger question.
That's true, yes.
With the tool now, is there something that's not working on the tool now when you went through 2019? I don't think we updated it in 2019. Did you have any problems in 2019, things that we need to update because it didn't work?
No, it worked fine for 2019.
Okay, good. So let me then revert to the other question of changes. So we were hoping not to do any changes in 2020. I was working on the notice this week. It looks like we'll probably have to do, at this point in time, I'm seeing 2 potential changes, both tied to the data standards, not pit count changes, though. They would impact the HIC, and they're just clarification about how to collect for the joint component and YHDP. So the changes we're looking at now impact, gosh, I could probably count the number of projects that we're talking about. It's probably less than 300 projects across the 23,000 records we get. So don't expect changes. We're hoping that it's limited to this. It's not finalized, so I can't promise there's nothing else. But we have no intent to add any new elements to the pit count, and I don't want to actually do any more to the HIC portion if I can avoid it, other than clarifying those 2, which actually hopefully will help you to move forward for next year.
Okay, and can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
The pit count will be collected. I noticed on the HDX2 we have the pit and HIC on there. So are we going to be submitting the information on the HDX or HDX2 for 2020?
You know, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that yet. We're having various conversations around what's going to be collected where and what the timeline is for these various data collection points. So the timeline isn't looking any different for those next year. The system performance measures will probably change our data collection timeline on that, and we're thinking about where that data is going to land. Okay. But yeah, no, as of right now, I have no clear answer on whether it's going to be on HDX 1.0 or 2.0.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Thanks, Michael. So William, we've got another question from the chat about rural pit resources in general, and I think that this can function both as a comment to take into consideration for the toolkit, but also maybe something to discuss right now as well. And that is, they say that outreach is hard in rural areas because they have so much space to cover. Are there any best practices for unsheltered outreach, specifically when it might just be 10 people within a 100-mile radius? That might be an exaggeration, but any kind of guidance would be very helpful.
Yeah, I love that question. I have the privilege of being the rural homelessness lead in our office, and I really enjoy it. I have great respect for all the work that all of our COCs do, but I see our rural folks have a lot of geography to cover, often with fewer staff members. And we've seen a lot of very creative models on the street outreach side for our rural communities. Many of them have 1 or 2 staff to cover hundreds, sometimes thousands of square miles. And it is amazing to see how much they rely on existing structures that aren't necessarily traditional homeless structures. Sometimes they are, but often they're not. So Maine, I'll give you their example. They, again, have very limited folks who are able to do street outreach, but they are engaging various groups like snowmobiling clubs who are going out in random areas that you just can't get to, but homeless people could get to, and if they don't want to be seen, they can end up there. So engaging groups like that to say, hey, can you just let us know if you see anyone? So I enjoy that kind of creative engagement. It's very common for our street outreach teams in rural areas to look for the formal or informal hub, kind of the know-it-all type person who it's their town, they know it. Sometimes that's the librarian, sometimes it's, you know, an elected official, sometimes it's the barber, and it's just a matter of going into the gas station often and starting there and saying, hey, you know, do you know anyone, have you seen anyone who's sleeping outside, or you know anyone who I can talk with who's helped in this area? And it's often a snowball effect. But what ends up happening is they kind of ask these folks to be their eyes and ears, so they don't go out there very often. It's more of a, you know, every once in a while, every couple of months, they'll go to all of the areas, or sometimes it's, you know, once in the year they get to all these areas. But they have people on the ground who can say, yeah, I saw somebody and we'd like to be able to help them. So it's a matter of finding champions and finding people who know what's going on and just utilizing that, and they're volunteer folks most of the time. There will be more on that. We're hoping to put out a little more resources. Again, we've seen a lot of wonderful examples of street outreach engagement all over the country and in rural areas, and we'll try to do more to amplify that so folks can get ideas.
Great. Thanks, William. We've got somebody asking, why do we have to count GPD in the PIT and HIC? I'm sorry, we've got some background noise.
Yeah, great question. We were having this conversation this week with the VA about GPD. So GPD does have a homeless requirement to it. We confirmed that this week. Even the clinical treatment one, that's actually what we were focusing our conversation on. That's what their regulatory requirement is. Their form of verification is different than ours. We have a similar case with our RIDE providers, right? That they don't often necessarily serve people who are coming from an unsheltered situation or coming from the street, and we ask you to include them as well. We do this because they are homeless providers. Unless you have something on the right side that shows that they're serving wards of the state, we ask you to include the project. And we do the same. For GPD because they're homeless programs, which actually isn't that different than our own homeless programs, right? The HUD-funded transitional housing programs, many of them you can take folks at risk of homelessness, and you can, right? It has a broader eligibility, and even our shelter context, right? So the very nature of the more crisis-based interactions often have components that are a little more nimble and allow larger catchment, but their core intent and the vast majority of who they're serving is homeless, so we ask you to include them.
Great. So we've got a couple of questions from somebody about, it seems like there might be some migrants who are coming into the U.S. and presenting at an emergency shelter for a short period of time and then are on their way. I feel like we already answered a part of this. Oh, they want to know if they should count people who are on their way to somewhere else as literally homeless when doing their PIT count if they're staying in an emergency shelter but are on their way somewhere else.
So this is a fun area where we give you a little flexibility. I'd say at the end of the day, it's going to end up being a case-by-case basis. There are some people who, let's say that they were working on a ranch and they had employment for 6 months of the year. They don't live in, let's just say, North Dakota or Montana or wherever it is normally, but they go there for the work. Outside of that, they don't have a place to stay, right? They literally are working there, getting housing as part of that work, and they have nowhere to go that other 6 months. Well, yeah, if you're in that other 6-month window, you have every right to count them as homeless because they are homeless. If you have somebody who is living in one area and moving to the other, and sure, they're not going to be in their house for 2 weeks, but they have a house and they're slowly making their way there, I probably would not count that as homeless, right? Even though that's not a traditional vacation principle, or right, it's certainly not that ideal kind of leisurely or recreational, quote-unquote, homeless for that. They're not kind of in the spirit of what we're talking about, people who don't have a place to go or a resource for housing, and those folks generally that you're talking about there or potentially talking about, sounds like they have a residence and they're just kind of making their way there. So that's what I'd say. Again, that's very broad strokes, and when you get to the details of each case, you'll just kind of have to make some calls about, is this person really kind of meeting the spirit of they're homeless, or are they, yeah, they're kind of in transition, but they came from a place, they're going to a place, it's just a matter of time for them to get there. And how long is that
William,
time?
even if they're staying in a bed that's paid for using, for example, COC funding, that principle would apply?
That's a good question.
I'm sorry, it would have to be ESG funding if it were an emergency shelter, but.
Right. So if they're residing in the emergency shelter bed, we'd say that they're staying in the shelters, and we would actually allow you to count them there. We'd probably say do count them, or not probably, we'd say count them. They're utilizing the shelter bed. That's a good question. If they're utilizing the homeless shelter or the crisis response system, I guess there's almost nothing to say you shouldn't do that. But if it's someone you're engaging either on the street or you're seeing them in the hotel-motel context, things get a little different there. So yeah, again, the devil's in the details, and you'd have to kind of play it out. We're happy to walk through that on the case-by-case if you have specific cases you want to talk through, but again, I suspect you'll talk through it for every individual.
This seems like an appropriate time to plug the AAQ for any of those specific questions in your community.
Yes.
Feel free to send us questions. We love answering them.
And I see Michelle's follow-up on engaging the rural street outreach piece. Michelle Milliken added that law enforcement's often used. I'm glad she said that. I meant to say that, because law enforcement, while not everyone's best friend, right, we know not every community has the best relationship with law enforcement. Law enforcement often is a very good resource and has been very positive in many of our rural communities as well as our non-rural communities. But especially when you just can't get out to an area, often the law enforcement has had some touch point or a more common touch point than you have. So law enforcement's great. We've also seen engagement on both national and state, sometimes county park authorities. So our national parks authority has been really good in many areas, but state parks are often more effective because they just have, they're more common to have state parks. So those are also other places to kind of reach out to.
Great. And I think the only other unanswered question that we have in the Q&A, I know there are a few comments, but we've been filtering the questions from the Q&A box, is what are the criteria that will be used to determine whether the proposed piggybacking on the youth count at another time of year will be approved or not? So this is going back to that question, William, that we had touched on before, where you said there might be some leeway, but we would need to take it on a case-by-case basis.
Yep, again, I'd look at proximity to the count. It would have to be after your pit count night, right? So if this event is December and your pit count night is January 31st, that wouldn't work. You need to do it after the count. Again, proximity to the end. So let's say you wanted to do one in March. Again, we try not to get that far away from the count, but there are sometimes good reasons for it. You would still have to get your data in by the deadline to us. We would not move or extend the submission deadline for that. So we rarely have the flexibility to move the deadline for submitting data. That's pretty hard and fast. So that's the other consideration, is the later it is, the harder it is for you to collate the data. You'd also have to think about your matching type ability. Is this going to be an observation principle? If it is, that's a little more difficult for us to allow it further out. If this is going to be you're collecting information as in an interview, and you can deduplicate that information from your larger pit count information, then we'd certainly be more amenable to that, because it allows you to address the duplication problem. That's certainly not everything, but those are core principles.
Awesome. Okay, so 2 more quick questions have come in that I think we can get to in the last 4 minutes of this call. First is, does HUD need to approve any local methodology changes in advance of the PIT count? If so, by when?
Great question. We do not need to approve them as long as you're confident that it meets the standards in the PIT count methodology guide. If you are not sure if it varies from that count, you certainly can send an AAQ or you can engage me directly. If you just want to engage on methodology, I love to talk about methodology and happy to provide ideas and talk through it. So I'm always open to that idea. In terms of timing, it actually depends more on when you're planning on implementing. I mean, we could approve that or look at it a couple days before you implement your count if somehow you think you can implement it in that amount of time. So we're flexible there, although don't email me January 27th and ask for approval for January 28th. My review period has got to be a little longer than that, but often I can review stuff, especially closer to the count, in a week or 2. So those take a little more to review than a mere question, so I do try to take methodology reviews pretty seriously. But again, we welcome that. You know, we tend to see the bad stuff on methodologies. We see problems more than we see good stuff. So I love to see good stuff, especially if you think it's good and aren't sure or want to share more. I'd love to see that because again, I see a lot of the negative, and I would like to see some of the positive along with it.
Yep, that's a great point, William. Okay, so I think this will be our last question that we answer. Do you have any tips on working with schools to better count homeless children and students?
Yeah, great question. So we've started by engaging the Department of Education. That's one thing that we have seen as our homework list. We have a fact sheet that actually the Department of Education created to provide to their folks. So we felt it would be better accepted for school liaisons to receive something from the Department of Education than from HUD. So that's a resource that's on our website now under the PIT count tools and resources in the subpopulation section. So if you want to start there, you have people who are willing but they're not sure what they're allowed to do, that is a place to start. They're generally cannot release information without consent, and that's very hard to get consent because youth are either unaccompanied or the parents, it's hard to engage them. So what we've done is we've used matching principles. We have kind of worked with the HMIS provider and the ed folks at times to see, you know, they'll do kind of a, is this person there, and a yes or no, or the ed folks will ask that of the HMIS side or the PIT count collection side. We've seen a little bit of that. That's hard to coordinate. It's very time intensive. More often, we've just pitched it as our common desire to serve the youth, and the liaisons often will join in kind of a daytime count. So if you have more of a targeted youth count that has a different method in particular, liaisons often want to do that, and they'll provide information on hotspots, and they'll be able to help you understand where to look. So we use them more on the planning side than we do on the engagement side for the night of the count. But we'd like to see more of that night of piece. We're interested as well.
Great. Well, I think that's the last thing we're going to address today. But again, the Ask a Question desk on the HUD Exchange is always open. And feel free to send us specific questions about if it's anything from where can I find the link to that planning worksheet that you brought up to, hey, I have this specific question about my PIT count. Can you help me? We're always happy to respond to those. And for those of you who attended, again, thank you so much for your time on this lovely Thursday, hopefully lovely where you are. And I will be in touch in the next couple of days with some of the resources that we talked about with the volunteer training toolkit and a survey form for you to provide some specific feedback on the structure and content of that to make sure that it is meeting the needs of your community. So with that, William, do you have anything else to say? Go for it.
No, thank you all. Again, you guys do fantastic work, and this is hard, and we appreciate it. So thank you.